What did I do? Why did this come on? Okay, I think, wow, the light came on. Good evening, members of the public, to the January 15th, 2025 monthly business meeting of the Open Space Board of Trustees. I would like to start with calling the roll, and I'll start with Trustee Carroll.
Present.
Glenn?
Present.
Robinson?
Here.
Zuckerman?
Here.
And I am here as chair. We have full attendance tonight. Yay. And all healthy. Okay, let's move on to reviewing and approving the minutes. And let's start with page 1. Any feedback, suggestions? Okay. Brady?
I just thought they were particularly well done.
Nice.
Seriously.
Nice job, Sam. Just one misspelling of my name on the under item 2. Just add an L. You got it right in the other spots. Thanks. Page 2. I had one question, and Sarah, this is maybe for you. I thought that the second paragraph where it said Sarah showed how her daughter's interests were shaped by these types of programs, and that she joins the field trips her younger daughter participates in. I think you mean Noah, who's your son. And so I recall that conversation. So I think you meant son. And I just happen to know.
Technically, it's both, but the
Okay.
younger one is a boy. So that's correct. Yeah. Attending the field trips has been many years with them. But yeah.
But that was just one other thing. Any other feedback? Okay, I'd like to, does anybody want to put forward a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
I move to approve the minutes as amended.
Second that motion.
Okay, and then I'll just call the roll this way. John?
I'll abstain. I was not present.
Thank you. Brady?
Yes.
And I'll vote yes.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
okay, so passes you with 4 votes, and John is abstaining. All right, that seems like so long ago. It's only been like 5 weeks ago, though. Let's move on to the public comment section. Lisa, are you going to read the rules of decorum? Cool.
The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement process, please visit this website. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during this meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. Participants are required to sign up to speak, using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. If you are joining in person and would like to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing, please sign up at the table and we'll call you up to speak at the podium. If you are joining online, you can raise your hand to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing. You can do that using the raise hand icon or by clicking the participants icon, then the 3 dots on the bottom right and select raise hand. We'll start with anyone who's signed up to speak in person. Giles Trotton, if you'd like to come up to the podium.
Good evening.
Sorry about that.
We just had following the rules of decorum. No need for violence. Okay. Okay. Use your words next time, Jeff. Good evening. I'll start. I just want to acknowledge, which I think I've done in the past, the OSMP staff. Just a couple days ago this week, I got an email from a member of the staff out of the blue wanting to connect with members of the community on a couple of issues that we have been engaged in over the last couple of months. So I just want to acknowledge that, appreciate that. I think it speaks well of the department. That was Paul Dennison. We're going to be meeting in early February to talk about a couple of things with some other community members. So I think it's important to acknowledge those things when they happen. I also want to acknowledge what's happened over the last week with what's been going on in Los Angeles with the wildfires. Sure. Over the last week with what's going on with the wildfires in Los Angeles. My son lives in Venice, California, which is right there. I've got a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law who've been evacuated. So from a family standpoint, we're very concerned about what's going on. It reminds us of what could go on very easily here in Boulder, right? As Forest Service scientist Jack Cohen has said, we don't really have a wildfire problem, we've got a home ignition problem. The fire adapted communities portion of the CWPP is critical to what's going to happen when, not if, the next wildfire event threatens the city of Boulder. We're 3 years removed from the Marshall Fire and 6 years removed from the Paradise Fire in California. And they have to ask, how much safer is Boulder today than 6 years ago or 3 years ago? From my standpoint, I don't think we've made a lot of progress during that time. There have been certain things that we've made progress on, but others have languished behind, again, from my perspective. But how much more resilient are we to a wildfire-driven urban firestorm if that event would happen today? I don't know if any of the Boulder members watched the recent wildfire resilience and water-wise landscaping city council meeting presentation. I was pretty disappointed. How long will it take Boulder to become a wildfire-resistant community if we're only making changes to new construction and when real estate transactions might take place? I think it's going to take us decades, and we don't have that long. My understanding is that OSMP will be accumulating, aggregating, and finalizing, prioritizing criteria, prioritizing recommendations from the CWPP. I'd like to know what the criteria and the framework is for prioritizing those recommendations. They're going to come in from all across the city of Boulder departments. I'm speaking to you guys because you have a voice. You can influence the city council. They're not experts. They require the input of staff. And from my standpoint, staff needs to provide clear direction to the city council. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Lisa, do we have another speaker signed up?
Not in person, but if you'd like to speak and you're online, please raise your hand now. And we do have Lynn Siegel.
Free Palestine and Gaza and use the funds we're using for genocide to fix our own country for fires. And if you look at the landscape in LA and you look at the landscape in Gaza, you don't see much difference. It's revolting. Also, stop subsidizing developers. The open space is massive funds in deficit for maintenance and operations. And for all these, 777 Broadway, 900 new students there. Do you know how these people impact? I mean, you do know. I'm stating the obvious. I hate to, rub in what you already know. Okay. but we have a deficit and we're building as fast as we can build. 930 some people at the Millennium rented by the bedroom. See, who owns Boulder? Does CU own Boulder or do we? And when a big fire comes here because of all this development and all the losses of lives from that, who's to blame for that? Stop at the level of the planning board and the other boards that you're dependent upon to have the open space and to deliver for the open space the way we need to. And, you know, for police and fire and the whole, you know, and the South Boulder Rec Center, which we can't even fund. You folks just blink because I know I watched the planning board. Papelios is going in, 4 stories, you know, the people can't even use the low income people can't even use the roofside decks, you know, Mackenzie Junction where they can't use the pool because they're too low income. You know, it's revolting. You know, for equality in Boulder. The wealth inequity here is huge and it's destroying this community. And the LA wildfires are just the perfect example of this. And the money spent on Gaza, it's revolting. It is disgusting. We have got to stop this double standard in this country. We're the most, you know, unacceptable behavior country in the world. And it's, you know, we're also the most, you know, with the most money and the most assets. And what do we do once our currency is devalued? Then what? We're going to crash like you never could believe. So please do something about our open space by stopping all of this extra development that just makes the prices go worse and makes it unequal for everyone. Done.
Thank you, Lynn.
I see no more hands.
No more hands? Okay. Then I'll go ahead and close public comment. Thank you. And we will move to matters from the board. We were provided one written information item, so we could start there regarding agricultural workforce housing guidelines. That was at the end of our packet. Does anybody want to have any questions or comment on that? Go ahead.
So, yeah, I just have a quick question about demand for the ag worker housing. Do we have enough generally to satisfy the demand for the folks who are tenants and workers on SMP properties? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll turn that over. Lauren, would you mind coming up? Lauren Kolb?
Thank you. Right now, we are meeting demand. As I noted, I think in the memo, we do have a bunch of tenants that have their own housing they own right now. So as they kind of retire out of farming, we anticipate that the next generation of tenants that we have coming in won't have that access to their own owned housing. So I think we anticipate as a department that demand increasing.
And I know that OSMP is not necessarily in the business of building housing, but is it of interest to think about to reduce commuting and fossil fuel use and having ag workers actually on the properties that they're working on? Is that an item that folks have queued up to think about potentially? I noticed there was a list of houses that are uninhabitable at this point. Maybe it's just a matter of fixing the ones we already have, or is there any interest in developing additional housing that would specifically be for workers?
I think of the housing stock we have housing that we can fix up, like the house on the Fort Chambers Poor Farm property. And we also have housing that is in currently market rate housing, so available to the general public that would pay that market rate. So we could convert that out of market rate housing into housing for ag workers and our tenants.
I would also add that
Thank you.
Boulder County, who has a pretty big leasing program as well, they have a fairly robust portfolio of housing as well. So the two agencies eventually maybe talking and collaborating more. We alluded to that in our document of how we would partner with tenants if we didn't have that demand. And so I think looking wholly at the whole county between the two agencies and this whole housing stock there is also part of the solution.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you.
It's not related to anything written, but I wanted to maybe take a minute during this time to, yeah, no. And so I want to take a minute, but to make sure that everybody else has commented on this first. Yeah.
We'll move back to that. Any other questions about the ag housing guidelines? Okay, I'll just weigh in that I didn't, and I know that we mentioned it in a couple, well, in the the written memo, and then also in our budget memo. I didn't realize that we had housing that was not on agriculture leases, and so I saw that in the budget memo that we are considering selling some of those. So I found this to be interesting that we had residential residents or properties.
Yeah, we're going to actually come back with a separate discussion with you all later this spring, I believe, about our residential portfolio. This is obviously related to it, but how it began 100 years ago when we started buying land, and you buy the property primarily for the land, but it's attached, and you buy the house as well. So we ended up with a portfolio of around 40 homes, residences that we have. If you would have asked us 5 to 10 years ago, not even half of what is now an agricultural lease was being used for agriculture. So our first priority was to try to use our housing to meet an open space charter purpose, which easily can be met with agricultural use. So we slowly have been converting a lot of our residences to support our agricultural, but there are going to end up being a handful of residences that we just don't see being able to really match an open space purpose to it. So what do we do with those? And one solution that we can come back with is there could be a couple of them that we don't need to own anymore. We don't need to sock money into it. Money we would get from a sale could be used to support other areas of the department. So we want to come back and talk generally about our inventory of houses, but then specifically, what do we do with those few that we don't feel have a charter purpose? So.
Thank you.
And would those be subject to the regular disposal
Yes,
process?
they would have to go through disposal, yes. And so we wanted to tee up a general conversation to then come back and possibly bring one, a specific one up and kind of see how that goes. But yeah, I would have to run through both board and council.
Okay, great. Yeah, I saw that under the budget memo. I was like, oh, we're going to possibly sell some of these residents, which makes sense. I have another question on the income. I'm really glad that you did this, by the way. I think it's super helpful to have these guidelines, and of course, want to provide housing to our ag workers, particularly our tenants. And when you think about income qualification, I saw in there that you if their income is exclusively from from their work on the farm, you're not asking how much. You're not actually asking them to substantiate it. But if they do have other income, then you're asking that they meet that qualification. And I'm just wondering why you decided to sort of like bifurcate the decision like that.
Sure, yeah, and I just want to clarify, this is just for farm workers only, that we wanted to have that no income verification. And the reason is we do have farm workers that will work 1 or 2 days on open space, and then they have a full-time job maybe somewhere else. And so they could have a considerable, income that exceeds, area median income or be very close. And so that's why we made that decision.
So if they were farm workers, then and their income was exclusively from working on the farm, then you're like, okay, we know that you're not going to buy a $6 million house in Boulder, but okay.
Yeah.
I get that. That makes sense. And then otherwise we would, like if they were a 2-family household, we would ask that they meet the normal affordable housing income requirements.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. That's good. Other questions on this particular topic? Okay. No? All right. And then I'll go back to you,
Thanks,
Sarah.
Well,
Under
yes.
matters from the board. Thank you, Lauren.
Since our agendas are so carefully prepared in advance, we didn't have on the agenda the issue of fire this month. I just wanted to go a little bit off script because of what's been happening in LA, and to acknowledge how vulnerable we are here in Boulder to fires and fire risk, and to really take a moment to not only like to first acknowledge that and to send out just a ton of love and care, of course, to everyone in Los Angeles, but to also really appreciate the efforts that are underway by this department and by the city. And I know I checked in with Dan about, well, what is happening and what are we doing? Just remind me one more time. And so he did send me a list, which I thought I would read in case anyone listening wants to tune in and to know when you can hear more about what we have happening here with open space on the agenda. So in April, we'll be getting an update on the 5-year Wildlife Resiliency Action Plan. I'm sorry, wildfire. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a long winter break with both of my kids home pretty much full time, which has been wonderful and exhausting. And then also we were able to secure dollars from the Climate Fund to bring on a staff person who is focused on developing this action plan. And I know somebody here in the public comments has already mentioned Dan is taking time to meet with local community members in February to talk more about concerns about wildfire and other issues in the city. And then also I love, Dan, you just said pretty much 4 out of 5 days at least, you are spending a good amount of time on this topic of wildfire. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. And also just a shout out to, there are things that are out of our control. We do get high winds here, and we do live on the edge of this vast open space, and we are certainly vulnerable. But insofar as I think it's like 99% of the time, the fires that are going to come through, we're doing everything that we're doing a lot of great things. And I think we can say with wholeheartedly everything that we possibly can be doing to be forward thinking in this matter. And so thank you guys. I want to acknowledge that. And also for anyone listening, just acknowledge that we're aware of this and actively working on it on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just put a lot of credit to the team that I work with. So it's not me. And I'm surrounded by a lot of people and a lot of citywide department. We have a wildfire executive team that is made up of department heads from around the city and the city manager's office. And then we have a core team, which is made up of sort of the practitioners around the city. So we have this cross collaboration amongst department staff that are working, daily on this stuff. So it's, the subject is sort of can get depressing if you think about it, but it's exciting work, and the amount of collaboration that's going on and the amount of creativity and enhancement that's happening is great. Giles is right, though. We can always be thinking more. We can always be thinking out of the box. We can also always consider things that we weren't considering before. Of course, everything's an evolution. Everything, you keep improving. So it's, we're not stopping, and Giles is great at sort of, keep asking the good questions. And the other thing that I just want to point out is Giles is well aware of this, but the community has their role to play too. It's just not city officials and we're going to save the day. We have a big part to play, but it's one of those issues where the whole community needs to be involved. Everybody needs to do their part. And then hopefully collectively, for a lot of the fires that are come our way, we could be more protected. There's always those singular events like Marshall where you have hurricane force winds and such dry stuff. And it's sometimes the tools in your toolbox is just not enough in certain conditions, but yeah. But thank you.
Yeah, it really truly is. Some of the beautiful things that have come out of this event on the flip side is watching the community in Los Angeles come together. One of my favorite reels on social media is of a bunch of people carrying shovels and crossing the street, going to dig lines and to clear fuels. And I think that it's hard not to take away the image of these fires just ripping through a community. But what I'm trying to take away and to tell my children to take away is the image of the whole community coming together and carrying their shovels across the street to go help their neighbors and bringing out food. And we really can stick it. The true resilience comes from the community itself. So thank you for the work you're doing and also for speaking to that. Okay, thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Harmon wants to speak, but I wanted to add on to what you just said before that, because Giles is somebody who comes here regularly to speak, and I know we have all kinds of participants, and but he has read the CWPP and he's very knowledgeable. And I just, in that I don't the last meeting that he came to speak, I think he ran out of time, so I asked him to send an email. And he had an outstanding question that was on December 15th that he sent that email. He did have an outstanding question, so I just want to be respectful toward him that somebody is getting back to him. Like he had a lot of comments in this email, but he did have a couple of email or questions, and one was and most sometimes you copy us on your responses, and I just want to make sure that we are responding to his open questions or anybody in the community. But one is, why is the WUI defined as a relatively thin strip of boulder land when it is well documented that 85 to 90% of wildfire home ignition is caused by embers that are carried significant distances, a mile or more, in advance of the fire perimeter? You don't have to answer that tonight, but I just want to make sure that there is a feedback loop in which we are responding to people's questions. And then I also wanted to comment on what I thought was a great response during the LA fires is that because it is an interdepartmental and an interagency effort to make our community safer. But what I liked was like the fire department had, and I know it's not cool to be on Twitter anymore, but I saw the tweet come out that they're like, "Hey, did you know that you can get an assessment on your home?" And I think this is like everybody has a part to play in this, and anybody who resides in a home has a part to play in making sure that there aren't fuels, right? And Giles touches on this with the juniper trees ordinance and all of that. And so I thought, well, that was well timed without feeling like we were, we know it all. But like, by the way, here's something that you can do as well. Like you can feel empowered and not so helpless. And so I'd love to see more of that just throughout all of the different agencies within Boulder doing. And it's okay to toot your own horn too, from an OSMP perspective,
Yeah,
because I know you do a lot of that.
yeah, one of the items that we're primarily will be focused on at the April meeting is making progress on that 5-year implementation plan, which is not an OSMP. We agreed to step up and take the lead in developing that plan, working across the city organization. But that is right now, it won't be 300, but there's like 300 recommendations, action steps that are called for in existing plans that is now all being inventoried, and we'll go through that and work with each department to determine its, level of action, current action, future action for each of those. But one of the things that we'll also look at is gap analysis. What are we missing here? Giles has pointed out to us that he doesn't feel we're doing enough on ignition prevention, for instance. Like, do we have specific recommendations for ignition prevention? So part of this too, when we come forward and talk a little bit about this plan with you, is acknowledging that there are going to be gaps. We're going to see some things like, oh, we don't have enough going on in that area, or we need to emphasize that. So we are not trying to pretend like we've got it all and we know it all, but at least having the comprehensive inventory in one place, we can start to analyze where those gaps are, where our emphasis need to be. Do we need to shift away from this and more to that? So that's the type of, we won't bring you a finalized plan by any means, but we'll give you an update on where we're at with all that in April.
Thank you. Go ahead, Harmon.
Yeah, and I realize, like Giles pointed out, that some of these things, like changing, over to fire-resistant structures and materials in our housing stock, it's not really an open space board of trustees issue. This is a building code issue. This is a city council issue. This is a planning board issue. But I think that so many of the things that we are doing right now in OSMP have a fire component to them. Like when we heard from Brian last month about the carbon footprint of the whole portfolio, and realizing that by doing doing mitigation projects, we can save a great deal of carbon release into the atmosphere through not having larger wildfires. That's stuff that nobody really was thinking about a couple decades ago. It's becoming stuff that forward thinking people are doing and thinking about. I think the connecting our our water courses back to their floodplains, doing our riparian restorations. Imagine trying to stop a fire that was going across, that goes across CU South now, compared to how much easier it's going to be to keep fire from going across CU South after the South Boulder Creek is reconnected to its floodplain. And those meadows are wet meadows instead of, dry grasses and stuff the way they are today. So I think, just like the idea that the open space staff is always looking for all the newest, best ways of healing the environment. And there's almost never a case where there isn't some sort of fire benefit to that. So I would just applaud you for doing that and hope you keep your eyes open, and I know you will.
Thank you. Does anybody want to bring up any other topics under matters from the board? Okay, if that's the case, then I think we'll close that section and move on to matters from the department. Back to you, Dan.
Right, thanks, Michelle. Tonight we have 3 different topic areas. You'll be hearing a lot from Casey French tonight. Our first is something that we promised to come back to the board and the community with, which is an update on a new phase we're going to be entering on the Fort Chambers Poor Farm planning process. I'm not going to steal too much thunder, but we had a big milestone in July, and we're moving off of that towards implementation on some aspects and some more detailed planning on others. And so we wanted Casey and Katie Knapp to come on and give you more details on what's in the work for 2025, especially around interpretation and education work at the site. So with that, I might turn it over to you first.
No, Katie.
Katie Knapp, all right. And she is
Yeah.
joining us remotely.
Hi. This is Katie Knapp. Can everybody hear me okay? So yeah, I am presenting remotely, but I am a principal planner with Open Space and Mountain Parks. And tonight we're providing some information about the next phase of planning, design, and engagement for the interpretive experience along the proposed healing trail at the Fort Chambers Poor Farm project. Okay, next slide. First, a little bit of background information. Open Space and Mountain Parks acquired this 113-acre property in 2018 due to the significant resources and adjacency to other OSMP properties. It's located on 63rd Street, north of Boulder Creek. It has agricultural lands of statewide significance. The riparian areas and hayfields support an abundance of wildlife. And in addition to being the presumed site of Fort Chambers, a house on the site is also listed on the National Register of Historic Places and housed the Boulder County Poor Farm from 1902 until 1918. Last year, we completed a concept plan for the site in collaboration with Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal representatives with a vision to heal the land and heal the people. Next slide. This concept plan includes 4 main elements: ecological restoration, an interpretive healing trail, visitor access, and farmstead improvements. The interpretive healing trail is the focus of our upcoming planning process, inviting both community members and the tribes to be involved with designing the interpretive experience along the healing trail. Next slide. In July of 2024, the board recommended we advance and implement the Fort Chambers Poor Farm concept plan and request the design process include consultation and community involvement with tribal representatives and interested community members who can help in the telling of all the stories related to the site, in developing content for the healing trail and other interpretive elements, including potentially a physical representation of the fort. Next slide. Following the board's guidance, we're starting a new planning process for the interpretive experience design. 5 engagement windows are being planned to involve the community in this design process. And the board will be updated at each step and will also have opportunities to share input. Next slide. The first engagement window will focus on listening and learning with the goal of hearing different experiences and stories. We're planning both in-person and online opportunities to encourage everyone to share their thoughts. The input received will be compiled and discussed with tribal representatives and reported out to the board and the community. Next slide. The second engagement window will focus on identifying themes and priorities. We want to understand what is most important to share out and also understand why. Next slide. In engagement window 3, we will design the flow of the interpretive experience, identifying how the stories will unfold along the healing trail, the order of themes, placement of elements, also exploring ideas for different features or elements. Next slide. So building off of that input that we receive, a draft design will be created for the healing trail, and it could potentially have some different alternatives. Engagement window 4 will help us understand the community's level of support for that draft design and also preferences for any potential alternatives, and provide an opportunity for input on a final design. Next slide. The input we receive will be used to create a final design for the interpretive experience that will be shared out to the community and the board prior to implementation. Next slide. This planning process will involve the community throughout, with engagement windows that include both in-person and online opportunities for sharing input. Engagement opportunities will be broadly announced and all are encouraged to be involved. Next slide. The planning process is anticipated to take approximately 15 to 18 months. The board will receive updates at each phase and will also have multiple opportunities to provide input during the process. Next slide. These elements shown on the slide here of the concept plan, ecological restoration, visitor access evaluation, and farmstead improvements are also being implemented. They're part of our 2025 work plan, and these don't include community engagement. Next slide. So our next steps include hiring a consultant to assist with the planning process, starting engagement window 1, the community exploration of information to share. And then the board will receive another update after we compile information from engagement activities. The timeline here shows where we are planning additional updates for the board throughout the planning process. All right, so this concludes the presentation. Dan and Casey, was there anything that you'd like to add?
No, not at this time. We're just here to answer questions. If the board has any.
Thank you. I'll open up the floor to questions or comments about any of this or the memo. Katie, while people are maybe gathering the thoughts, I liked how in that presentation you put the dates under each engagement window. I kind of wish it was also in our packet. That way I was able to, it's a 15-month window with 15-month process with 5 windows starting Q1 and Q2, and then kind of could infer what the other timeframes would be, but just kind of wish that that was also in our packet as well. But otherwise, think you're on the right track. Other question, I know you're reaching out to the tribal leaders. Are you also going to proactive? I know that you have it on the project website, what this process is going to look like, but are you also proactively reaching out to those folks who said they want to be part of the process and want a seat at the table?
Yes, we haven't done the announcements of the engagement yet. The dates haven't been set, but that's definitely something that we'll be doing.
Sarah?
I just wanted to clarify on the agricultural farmstead enhancements, the proposal for tenants. It was put out on the 9th of December, and is there another round of, is it closing mid-January, or is there a second announcement coming in January? Meaning like now, but isn't it mid-January?
Yeah, hi, Heather Swanson. So the announcement goes out in December, but the actual detailed RFP actually went out today, so January 15th. There's a mandatory site visit for anybody who's interested in bidding on the lease. I believe it's on the 27th of January, and then the process will close sometime, I think it's in mid-February.
Okay, great. And fabulous. I'll check in with you later about where to find that information.
Okay, sure.
Thanks. Unless you feel like we should be stating it here, but otherwise I'll check in with you later.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Harmon?
Thank you. So I was really glad to see that there was participation from the community as well as tribal members planned. And I just wanted to reiterate how strongly I feel about that. And really that doesn't come from just inside. That comes from what I've learned from sitting on the board. Last March, a tribal representative named Chester spoke to us before our regular meeting and talked about how everyone who comes to Fort Chambers should hear the whole story of the land. And he talked about how that meant that we needed to tell both sides of the story or all sides of the story. And I commented at the time how generous of spirit that was of him to also want to hear the story of the oppressing forces that marshaled, that mustered at Fort Chambers before the Sand Creek Massacre. And he just looked at me like, well, of course. Why didn't you figure that out? And I still didn't really get it until a few months later when we were here, and a member of the Valmont community was really upset at the way that the obelisk that used to be there was removed by the city, and felt, that it should have been given more dignity, and her family had been part of the contracting for an installation of that obelisk. And so I just wanted to thank you for the number of times in the staff report that it says that the community and the tribes are going to be consulted, and just remind you of, for if you want to listen to what Chester said, if we want healing and if we want to really heal the land and heal the people, then the whole story has to be told.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. We're looking forward to having the community be involved in the process, and so it'll be nice to have to move forward with that.
Awesome.
Excellent. So I think that's it from us about this topic. Dan?
Thank you, Katie, for joining us tonight. I know where you're at and appreciate you taking the time off of that.
Thanks.
All right, we're going to move into our second topic, which is actually a request from the board. I think this fall, the board thought it might be a good time, now that we have a full year of implementing e-bikes onto the system, to come back and give you a general sense of how we think things are going. So we put a memo together for you and a very brief presentation of our pulse of that. And so Casey French is here to provide that brief presentation and then answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So as he said, I'm here tonight to give you guys just a really brief overview on the implementation of e-biking and how that's been going on open space. Next slide. So tonight I'm just going to do a very brief bit of background, remind ourselves of the management approach that we discussed during the process to allow biking, and then share some information on the implementation and our takeaways. Next slide. So as of July 1st, 2023, open space visitors are allowed to ride Class 1 and Class 2 e-bikes on certain trails. So e-bikes are allowed on all trails east of Broadway or US 36 that allow a bike, and as well as a select few trails west of Broadway. So those are South Foothills, Wonderland Lake, Boulder Canyon, and Chapman Drive. And so the primary objectives of allowing e-biking on certain open space trails was improved access for community members of more ages and abilities to enjoy open space trails, providing a consistent visitor experience across interconnected trails where e-bike regulations previously differed, more adaptive management by considering alternatives to disposal of open space managed lands, and also supporting broader city climate goals. So by reducing the number of vehicle miles potentially traveled to reach local trails, and which in turn help preserve the ecosystems and habitats that make up open space. So during the evaluation, we identified a holistic approach to managing e-biking, which is similar to the way we manage biking and other passive recreational activities. So the long-term management of e-biking includes trail design and maintenance, monitoring, enforcement, and education and outreach. So as part of our education and outreach efforts, we updated our interactive materials on the website to inform the community about, which trails allow e-biking, and added messaging about how to e-bike responsibly on open space. Additionally, the presence of the land by both staff and volunteers focused on education and outreach to support our visitors and just raise awareness of the changes in management and rules. Staff and volunteers did not receive a lot of e-bike feedback from the community since allowing e-biking. So the enforcement of e-biking is being tracked together with biking. Ranger patrols are intended to educate visitors of the regulations and also address violations, visitor safety concerns, or complaints. In the time period of just a little bit more than a year, around 15 months, rangers recorded 7 interactions with e-biking on open space lands not in compliance with regulations. And OSMP will continue to patrol, track interactions, and summons issued. So starting in 2024, the on-site intercept survey added e-biking as a category, and that was added distinct from traditional biking and alongside other activities allowed. And this will allow us to report out on changes, if any, that may be attributed to e-biking on open space. The 2024 surveys also formally implemented a cyclical data approach cycle. And we also collected data on bikes and e-bikes parked at OSMP trailheads and access points. And the analysis of this data has not occurred yet, but there were no glaring red flags. So in regards to trail design and maintenance, there is guidance that can support speed and conflict mitigation on multi-use trails. And while no specific trail repairs or needs emerged from allowing e-bikes over the last 15 months, we will continue ongoing efforts to strategically prioritize trail enhancements. So the takeaway we had is that implementation of e-biking on OSMP lands is going well. The education and outreach efforts were well received by the community. There was minimal community feedback regarding conflicts. There were very few ranger interactions and summons issued. And we'll continue with system-wide cyclical monitoring and prioritized trail maintenance. And that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Casey.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Would we like to comment or have questions on this topic? I see everybody's touching their buttons. Go ahead. Go ahead, John.
I did have a clarifying question on the chart where you kind of show mountain biking prohibited, not e-bike. Was that an e-bike on a trail where bikes weren't allowed in general? Or I'm trying to understand the difference between the two rows there, where you have mountain biking prohibited, not e-bike, and e-biking prohibited.
Oh, I think it is. Yes, I think the mountain biking permitted. The first row is just biking because the rangers. Their database collects information on biking and e-biking, and here we were just separating out the bikes from the e-bikes, the traditional bikes.
Okay, so that first row is traditional bikes.
Yes.
That were biking on trails where biking was not allowed generally.
Or yes, or another
Okay.
or another regulation.
Yeah.
They were Yeah.
So if we look at this, right, there's only 7 interactions that were specifically related to e-bikes.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think Brady, you wanted to go? You can, yeah, you can hit your
I can
button.
touch my, okay, thanks. I just wanted to thank you all for the detailed memo, the crisp presentation, and giving us ample time to discuss. This was something we talked about in the retreat, wanting to have in the meetings, and I think this is exactly what we were talking about, so thank you for that. I have a question. If someone has a disability, whatever that may be, what is the process for them to get permission to use one of these trails with an e-bike that is open to mountain biking and not open to e-bikes? For example, the North Sky Trail, I'm not going to name names, but I was out there on one of the early days, and someone who knows exactly what they're doing was out there on an e-bike and said that they had permission to do so based on their own health status. And so I just want to, I'm just curious what the process is for that and yeah, how that works.
So I can start. Oh yeah, Lisa might be able to
And I'd
help.
like to piggyback on that question because I know that it's when that ADA does, yeah, that people with disabilities are allowed to take electric bikes even when they're not actually allowed. And having ridden, I think with that day with you, Jeff, and then I think with somebody else, like you have to be very careful about who you approach about this because asking them to identify their disability is also not okay from an OSMP standpoint. That's probably where you're going, Lisa.
Yeah, hi Lisa. Just wanted to, you got it exactly correct. With the disability, you're able to use electric mobility devices on our trail system without providing any sort of proof or evidence. And you are not able to ask about the nature or extent of someone's disability either. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
It does. And then, so I just wonder like how you get to that number 7, that in interactions, like was that a proactive inquiry by a ranger that said, hey, e-bikes are not allowed here? And then if that response was met, it was met with a response of, well, actually I have a disability. And then you just stop there and you're like, okay, have a nice day. Or do you even broach, how do you broach that subject? So that you get 7 interactions.
Lisa's also a former ranger, so she's probably our best voice at the moment for this.
Yeah, apologies for not having a ranger here that could speak to some more current examples, but that's exactly right. You do your best to ask questions that are appropriate to the violation that's observed in the field, and given the responses, and you adjust appropriately. And so I'm not sure the nature of the 7 violations that did occur, how they occurred, or how that conversation went. But if someone does mention that they have a disability, then that kind of ends the conversation.
Thank you. Other questions?
So that's the process for having permission to do
Yeah,
so
that's-
too,
that-
is
yes,
just
that's
is saying
my-
that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess the other follow-up question, first of all, I'm really shocked at the data because having endured that entire process, we thought the sky was going to fall. In our
Not everybody did.
Not everybody did. But if you were part of that process, many people thought that the sky was going to fall. It is still all fine. And we've even gotten some positive feedback. I mean, I love the conclusion that you made, that closing paragraph in your memo, which just put a finer point on how it's going. And so I want to thank you all for taking on the policy change to begin with. And how, because it really opens up so many other possibilities for our community, like having the 36 bikeway be built, and then also be built on open space property, because now e-bikes are allowed to be on open space owned properties. So I know it was a lot of hard work to get to that point, and I'm proud of everything that you all did and we collectively did to get to this point, and find that data interesting. I guess the follow-up question, because I know that one of our goals is to, there's a climate impact to this, and broadening the range in which people can get to trails that they would normally bike on, um, and being able to go a farther distance, and possibly using e-bikes. When do we take this data and we say, actually, so I know like, what's next? What's next? I know that you had the management cycle, but when would we consider that we opening up additional trails because they meet some of our other goals, like 7C, so opening additional trails to e-biking that already allow bikes, not, yeah.
Well, we recently we were very strategic in the way we brought this to the board with the motion that we could add trails without having to revisit the ordinance. So, but we right now I think we are proceeding with what was in the spirit of alternative B, which is trails east of Broadway and the select few west of Broadway. So recently, we implemented a little bit of the North TSA, and one of the North TSA recommendations was for the Cobalt Trail to be open to bikes after it was rerouted. And so we allowed e-bikes on that. So that was kind of within the spirit of, the overarching motion that passed. Right now, we don't have it on our work plan to be prioritized for we said anything outside of that spirit would need community involvement again. If we were going to open every trail up to e-bikes, that really required a community discussion. We don't have that as a priority in the next several years to revisit that community discussion as of now.
I would also say one of the other 4 points of why we wanted to embark in a policy change to begin with is consistency with mainly with Boulder County on how they do it. And right now we are in alignment for both of our approaches of where they're allowed and where they're not. And so we also wanted just to keep an eye on keeping that consistency with our open space partner, who a lot of our trails sort of commingle with, and monitor what they're doing and over time as well. So to maintain that consistency.
Casey, can you remind me though, if the city manager now has, and maybe they did before, had the ability to add additional trails, although what you're saying is that you would like to have community engagement, it wouldn't actually need another policy or ordinance change. The city manager has the power to add additional trails.
Correct. We're proceeding within the spirit of the general guidance is trails are east of Broadway and a select few west of Broadway. So, that means if we were to implement a regional trail east of Broadway that allowed biking and e-biking, I think that's within the spirit. It's a new trail. If that makes sense, when we're talking about really revisiting that whole discussion about where e-bikes are generally allowed, that's where we feel from a planning perspective, more community discussion would be needed.
And I could just tell you the nuance too between what is embedded in policy or ordinance versus spirit and even what council said. So I think and when there's a gray area in there, I think the direction that we would get is that if we're doing something beyond what council's spirit was as well, that we would want to go back to council in which they're going to ask, what kind of engagement do we do with the community? So if we were to go back, let's say, and put it on our work plan this year that all trails open to biking are now open to e-biking, we would want to go back and do that engagement, do a touch with the board, do a touch with the council. And we just don't have it on our work plan for right now.
So, thanks, Michelle. So at the risk of just crassly putting out on the table what I sense that we're sort of tiptoeing around, is the spirit of the direction that e-bikes, is it that e-bikes on select trails west of Broadway, that notion, the spirit behind that notion is that those are steeper trails and e-bikes are too much of a cheat code for those trails, and we don't know how much damage the additional usage on those steeper trails would create? I just want to hear, specifically what the thought is on that.
There were a variety of reasons that the community was not supportive of allowing trails. It didn't have to do necessarily a little bit with the steepness. There was some community members did express concern around that. It was more about just not a lot of community members not supporting e-bikes on all trails where biking that was allowed. And so we had that discussion and decided to, we went with alternative B, which was east of Broadway, and a select few trails that were interconnected. The trails on the west side of the Broadway are just kind of part of larger regional pathways.
I also, and maybe my recollection is wrong on that, but I think the staff's this was an interesting one because staff's recommendation was different than board's recommendation. So council had a staff recommendation, a board recommendation. The board's recommendation was very narrow when they would allow it. We were pretty much saying east of Broadway, and then council went in and adopted ours, plus they added a couple of trails west. And so just a reminder of all of that's how that sort of decision ended up. I would also say that this is we put trail counters in. We're collecting data throughout 2024. I think so far things are looking good. A lot of that data that we're collecting is going to be interesting to kind of see, did biking use increase in these trails? If so, how did it compare to trends over time? And that type of trend analysis will just take a couple of years to sort of to play itself out. But we'd be more than happy to, in a written memo, to report back a little bit on what we're seeing from the HD data on trail visitation and bike visitation on select trails from implementation of the e-bikes to the present time, and then we could start tracking that trend over time too.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm all for the go slow, data driven approach, and I'm not suggesting that we just say any trail that's open to bikes should be open to e-bikes as well, because I think there are things we don't know about that yet. If you put an e-bike on a steeper trail with knobby tires, with its additional torque, does it really tear up the trail more than regular bikes do? We need to learn some of this stuff. But I also think that from a environmental perspective and a lifestyle perspective, my vision is probably that we're heading towards more e-bike access, and that's partly just because of the way that I see them being used. Like I can tell which people are poaching the trails on e-bikes when I'm out. I probably put a couple 100 miles on my mountain bike on mountain bike trails this summer, and I saw a lot of e-bikers out there. And my experience is that most of them were like people who are older than 50, and I never had a bad interaction with any of them, and none of them were going too fast. The real speed demons out there are like pretty super athletes riding conventional bikes. So if you're worried about, getting hit by somebody who's going 25 miles an hour faster than you are, it's probably not somebody on an e-bike, in my experience. And I've seen, again, people who will remain nameless, like some friends of mine who are older folks who get out to the trail because they can take their e-bike. And they tend to be really respectful and ride it on low power so that they're trying to just sort of make up for their age and the weight of the bike. But they're still pedaling, and they just get their ride in. So, my experience as one board member who spends a lot of time on mountain bike trails is that, the e-bikes are great for getting to the trail without using your car, not loading up parking lots, and for helping people who need a little bit of help. And I really haven't seen a lot of negatives.
Thanks, Harmon. I guess, you brought up how that public input went. I think John and I were here for the whole process, and we did see that we were in the minority on that vote. We were in support of staff's recommendation, and it was a split vote, 3-2. Brady was not yet on the board. And city council, as you said, Dan, overturned the OSBT's recommendation, and in fact, added more access. So I think that whole progression and tells you kind of how the community is changing. And because the sky hasn't fallen in this data that you're tracking, and if it continues to stay that way, I would assume that we would adaptively manage toward the community's needs and desires, because it's changing as our population continues to get older. There are going to be more people who want to continue to access trails on their bikes and get outside, because that's something that they used to love. And just the fact that they're 84 years old now, they may not want to say that they don't ever want to enjoy Springbrook Loop on a bike anymore, for example, or that parents are aging and they still want to keep up with their teenagers because we waited too long to have kids. But anyway, I just think that because that process had a lot of opinions. I mean, my recollection is that people who opposed the e-bikes on west of Broadway just generally opposed bikes, period. And certainly not on west of Broadway. So I just want to, I know that you're a data-driven department to continue to watch that data and also be in touch with the community's needs. I just also want to layer in one other piece of it is that technology is improving and you can't even tell. I mean, bikes are getting to a point where you can't tell that they're e-bikes. I don't even know that at a certain point that you can even hear it because you used to be able to hear like a whizzing sound. And so from an enforcement standpoint, we may also have to just accept that we aren't going to know. So why would we eventually, I'm not saying today or in your work plan in the next 3 years, but at some point we may need to say, okay, we want our entire community to have access to these trails. And at a certain point, be like, we can't tell the difference anyway. Just be a little bit pragmatic from that perspective. I want to thank you for bringing this to us in a format where we could actually have a discussion because it was such a big process. I think it deserved some meeting time.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks, Casey.
Thanks.
Chair, we're right on time. Our third and final matters from the department today is going to be our first, we don't waste any time. It's now 2025, so it's our first touch of the 2026 budget. And today's purpose was outlined well in the memo. This idea behind this formatted meeting came out of a board retreat from 2023 in which we wanted our first budget touch to be more of that strategic level of what is that high level guidance. And so this was our second meeting. We had one this year or this time last year. And this is a repeat of kicking off budget season with this type of meeting. And in the memo, Sam will also, and Lauren will also touch upon what our spring touches look like, even summer touches look like with y'all. So with that, am I turning it over to Lauren Kilcoyne first? All right, there we
You
go.
may be asking why. Why is Lauren at the dais? Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Kilcoyne. I'm one of the deputy directors here at Open Space, joined by Sam McQueen, our business services senior manager. It's been a few years now since I was in Sam's seat as our budget manager, and Sam's done a fantastic job stewarding us through the last few budget cycles. Wanted the board to just be aware Sam's going to be out on leave for a few months this summer. So we are spending the next several months getting me up to speed and transitioning work and making sure that I'm prepared when she goes out to step into her shoes, which will be no easy task. So for today in our next presentation, we're going to just split the presentation, and behind the scenes she'll be getting me ready, and then you're stuck with me. So good luck. It's going to be great. I'm just a little rusty and we'll get through it. But I'll go off script for a minute before we dive in. I also just want to give Sam and the team kudos. We have been prepping for the last 18 months to go live with a new city financial system, which launched last Monday. And I don't think I could overstate how much work that has been. It's been a remarkable lift, and both Sam and Cole were asked to be on the core team for the whole city because of their skill in configuring enterprise systems and understanding the technical work of finance. And Sam was asked to actually run trainings for the whole city because of her ability to communicate complex information. And so that is not easy to do while also getting ready for the 2026 budget. So very grateful for the team, and I will do my best in her absence in a few months to step in, but she's leaving us in a good spot. So for tonight, on the next slide here, we are starting very high level with an overview of our strategic budget guidance. We will be discussing implementation of recent priority areas for us and what we're looking at currently in 2025 heading into 2026. Sam will go through the budget process timeline, and then we'll have question and discussion.
And one thing I wanted to say about the strategic priorities, our cadence, as Dan mentioned, and the reason for this January presentation is really a reflection of feedback that we've gotten from you all in wanting early engagement on the budget process. So very understandably, when April and May happen and you're in the weeds on very specific numbers, you're asking questions like, can you put this in context for me? What does this all mean? And so last year and this year, we've been trying to really zoom out and set the stage in a strategic way to give you that background information to hopefully set the rest of the process up for success. So additionally, in our retreat with you all this past fall, we were listening to you around your priorities, what you want your time at the board to mean and look like. And we want to make sure that our budget priorities align with what we're hearing from you, what we're hearing from the public, what's in the master plan, et cetera. So on items like climate, which we'll be talking about later, we clearly heard from several trustees that this is an area where you want to see us continuing to accelerate our work. We've heard it earlier tonight. For topics like maintenance and facilities, the state of Chautauqua was a topic. We really see the feedback that we got from you as very aligned with our strategy around asset management. So we're always checking for that alignment and that engagement so that by the time we're hitting the numbers, you feel like your feedback is reflected, that you understand where we're heading. So that's all I have to say about that. Next slide. So when we think about our strategic budget guidance, we have no shortage of guiding documents in this organization that help us to inform our work. Some of them are listed here. So our sustainability, equity, and resilience framework as a city, the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, the citywide strategic plan, the open space master plan, all of our other open space plans, the ag plan, forestry plan, grassland plan, et cetera. And then tonight we're talking about our strategic priority areas, which really help us think about like a 2 to 3 year sprint on some of that political guidance, right? And the guidance in our plans. So if you are questioning how do you organize this, on the next slide, we use this upside down triangle a lot in our planning processes to try to represent the level of detail and the scale of some of these plans. So our highest level visionary guidance is coming out of that sustainability, equity, and resilience framework. And then we get down to a greater level of detail later on department guidance. So on the next slide, what I mean by that, the sustainability, equity, and resilience framework is really just meant to communicate at the highest level what we as a city government are trying to accomplish in this community. We want everybody in this community to feel safe, healthy, and socially thriving, that they live in a livable community, accessible and connected, environmentally sustainable, responsibly governed, and economically vital. So these are, well, aspirational in some ways, but hopefully what people experience in living here and being served by our government, right? So we focus most of our budget materials for you on connecting to our master plan, but behind the scenes, we are also connecting our budget investments to these categories. So as an example, in our division of central services, which has technology, finance, planning, real estate, we track our budgets in the city budget book to the category of responsibly governed in large part. So we're trying to make those connections so that when the city reports out to the broader community through our budgeting tool, they can see how those budget dollars are allocated to these priorities. On the next slide, we start to dig into a little bit deeper of detail as we go down the list. So several years ago when I was in Sam's seat, the Boulder Valley Comp Plan was actually, well, I guess that's the oldest of these. It predates the master plan, and we would go right from department guidance up to the Boulder Valley Comp Plan. So a couple of years ago, the city manager, which I think makes a lot of good sense, was noticing, okay, what is it that's going to tie all our city departments together, all the different master plans for the different departments together. And so we all went to work together over the last couple of years to come up with that city strategic plan. And what you'll see in the memo that Sam wrote is under those categories I read you, for example, safe, there are then strategies that we are trying to focus on as a city organization over the next 2 to 3 years. The Rangers, for example, support safety initiatives. Many of our programs support environmental sustainability. So as a way to bring us all together and provide a common vision so that the community can understand what the whole city is working towards. Now, that doesn't tell you everything we do, nor should it. It would be impossible to have a city strategic plan that listed every service that the city provides, but we do see ourselves reflected. And then that department guidance at the bottom of the triangle is where we get into more detail so that the community can then understand everything we do, much of which is not then in that plan. So next slide. And so the fun just continues from there. When we talk about department guidance, this is I mean, none of you are strangers to this. We know in 2019, we adopted a department master plan. It was our first master plan, and it allowed us to set a 10-year vision for this organization. We take that extremely seriously when we think about the budget. And so what you've seen from us over the last several years since the master plan was adopted is every capital project is tied to a strategy. We're reporting on how much of our money goes to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We're making work plan decisions based on some of these alignments, right? Like we're cutting projects, we're saying no to projects that don't meet those top priorities of the master plan. So there's always more work than we can accomplish in a given year, but we really take our budget alignment to the master plan really seriously. So one of the places now that we have a city strategic plan that we'd like to grow is in being able to do both, right? We want to maintain that connection to the master plan, and we want to make sure that the city understands how we're making investments in the city strategic plan, and we're still figuring that out. So as we bring forward the 2026 budget, you'll start to hear both of those things come through, and we're trying to maintain as much reporting on the master plan as we can. I won't spend a ton of time on these remaining pieces of this triangle. System-wide management plans I've already referenced, and then our trail study area. We just get into a greater level of specificity the more that you go down here, ending with our strategic priority areas for our budget. Next slide. This is great and timely considering the conversation that we just had about planning. I am biased as a budget person, but I view the budget as the place where everything intersects and connects and come together, right? So we have all this great guidance from the city, and then we have upcoming planning initiatives like we just mentioned, and then we have all this great ground up work on asset management and maintenance. So in March, outside of the budget cadence, but as part of Casey's planning cadence, we will be bringing to you our 6-year planning work plan and the big public engagement initiatives that we anticipate will be taking on in the next 6 years. How that works, if you look at our CIP in any given year, probably half of it is us implementing on commitments we've made in previous plans, right? So anytime we take on something like this, a new planning project, we know that will cascade over the next 6-year CIP, and you'll see implementation items from those things start to show up in the budget. Like the plans we just discussed, all of this involves implementation, and then we're always trying to balance with all of the plans that we have which implementation items to fund out of those plans in any given year. So we want to make sure we're daylighting our 6-year planning horizon to you. And that's actually something that you all brought up at the end of 2023 in the 2023 retreat. We heard from this group, like, we want to know more about the planning horizon, the planning framework. How do you keep these plans alive? So we've been working on that internally, and we're ready now to talk to you about what we see that we might be doing in the next 6 years and get your feedback on that. From the ground up, where I say this all sort of comes together, the other part of our budget is the ongoing work that it takes to take care of what we have, right? So one of our strategic priorities, but also a big part of how we think, is prioritizing maintenance and stewardship. So that's asset management, trail condition assessments, facility maintenance, and the other part of our CIP that's not plan implementation is that, right? Every year you see a line item for fencing, irrigation infrastructure, facilities maintenance. So we're always trying to balance those things. How do we deliver on commitments for the community and take care of what we have? And we're always trying to strike the right balance there, and we rely on your feedback to help us do that. So my last slide, and then I will stop talking and hand it off to Sam, is just to orient us to the master plan tier 1 strategies. So we have 10 of them, and we've been doing these strategic priority documents for, I don't know, a while, 10 years or so. And before the master plan, it looked like flood recovery or finish a TSA or something like that. But since the master plan was adopted, we've been trying to organize these 2 to 3 year sprints around tier 1 strategies. So in 2019, the topics at that time, the biggest topics were reduce trail maintenance backlog, address conflicts between agriculture and prairie dogs. So we were really ramping up our investments in those things, adding trail crews, multi-millions of dollars in the CIP, a couple $1 million towards prairie dogs. And we make this sprint and this acceleration. And then at some point, whatever percentage of that becomes operationalized and institutionalized. And then we're just doing it. And we're not saying that it's an enhancement, right? So part of the goal of these 2 to 3 year sprints is to make sure that we're delivering on what we said we would do to the community. You know, like over 10 years, we're going to accelerate on all 10 of these things. And we want to make sure we're organizing that in a really effective way, right? So where we're at now, which Sam will talk about more, is picking the things that are most important to our community right now. We've heard wildland fire and climate change very loudly, presence on the land, asset management. And so that's really just to connect the dots. That's how we're picking these things and organizing around them. So with that, I will hand it off to Sam.
Thanks, Lauren. And I'm grateful to you for taking this on with me today. So I'm just to build off of what Lauren had shared, we're going to look at a quick example of how we've shown Tier 1 master plan strategies in our budget conversations. So during the 2025 budget planning process with OSBT, which took place last year, spring and summer 2024, we showed you our 6-year capital improvement program or CIP investments in each tier of the master plan strategies. This is an example of an actual table that we showed you last year. Overall, you can see the investment by tier in the CIP is consistent with the department's goal to prioritize Tier 1 strategies. We're trying to make these kinds of ties with you again as we plan for the 2026 budget. So I just wanted to remind you all how these show up. And as Lauren mentioned, we are working with the finance department to make those stronger ties with the citywide strategic plan with our dollar amount so that we can start to share that information as well. So we're just understanding how they want us to do that too. We're going to shift our focus now to strategic priority areas, this bottom section of the upside down pyramid. OSMP strategic priority areas are just one of several citywide or department-wide strategic budget guidance tools that we referenced earlier in the presentation. They are internal staff priorities, and the attachment we included in this month's packet is really an internal OSMP guidance document that we just want to daylight here. The department's strategic priority areas are listed separately from the upside down pyramid we just reviewed because, as Lauren mentioned, they're used to call out priorities from other guidance for particular emphasis in a given period. So they're also used to communicate goals for OSMP staff and help to set priorities for major projects or initiatives. And the strategic priority areas are typically shared with staff as part of the budget planning process for the next year. So we're at the midpoint of our current strategic priority areas implementation for 24 and 25, and we expect much of this work to carry into 2026. The current OSMP strategic priority areas are, I'm just going to call them out here, wildfire and climate resilience implementation, enhanced presence on the land, and looking ahead, prioritized integrated work planning and budget. In practice, these have been used to inform OSBT agenda topics and budget priorities. So I want to just show you here a few instances where the current strategic priority areas were used to develop agenda items for the OSBT in the last year. So in February 2024, staff came to you with an update on the comprehensive fee study, which is part of that prioritized integrated work planning and budget priority area. In May 2024, we came to you with an update on WUI fuels management efforts, which does tie to the wildfire and climate resilience implementation. And you can see the MADS assignments and Flagstaff management update both came out of conversations to raise strategic priority areas as important board items in 2024. Just a note that these are examples. I think even throughout tonight, you've probably heard of some of the other ties that have come out of some of these. So we just wanted to call out some of the examples that we've tried to tie to board items. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide. It's an example of the use of strategic priority areas to guide our budget decisions. You can see from the small text on this slide that we've prioritized wildfire and climate resilience in the budget, whether that's through the addition of dollars or programs or reallocating existing resources to support the work when budgets are tight. So the first section shows several examples of personnel actions we've taken to further the priority, including the addition of a wildfire senior program manager, a fixed-term wildfire resilience program manager, conversion of a permit coordinator to a senior policy analyst for climate resilience, conversion of a water resources position to focus on fuels management, and several changes to the forestry work group to increase staffing capacity. On the non-personnel operating budget side, we've allocated about $300,000 per year from the city's climate tax fund, which has also come up in conversations tonight, to support or enhance work like the community wildfire protection plan implementation, WUI fuels mitigation, and ditch fuel maintenance. We've also made investments on the CIP side of the budget. OSMP has invested 150 to 300,000 per year to fund implementation of the OSMP climate plan, which you saw last month. And the department has allocated 50 to 125,000 per year for fuels mitigation. We also use the strategic priority areas to inform our grant seeking efforts. So for instance, we're expecting exciting grants for a building electrification project and the addition of electric vehicle charging stations, which staff sought with the understanding that we want to accelerate climate resilience work in the department. Okay. And then finally, we just want to walk you through a proposed timeline for touch points with the OSBT for the 2026 budget planning process. We're talking to you now about strategic budget guidance, similar to the timeline for this discussion last year, which you can see on the top. That's the 2025 planning process that happened last year. The bottom is our 2026 planning, proposed planning process. We are proposing a change to the conversations we held in April and May last year. So May is the month when we typically receive significant information from the city's finance department that helps guide any changes to our plans for next year's budget, including a 6-year revenue forecast that we receive and internal guidance for citywide costs. For that reason, we are proposing to come to you in April with a presentation on last year's revenues and what we're thinking for the 2026 budget. And then we'll provide you with a written update in May with any new information that we receive. It'll give us the opportunity to figure out if we need to change course or provide you with the updated information when we come back with presentations in June and July. And then we're proposing to hold a public hearing and get OSBT's recommendation on the 2026 CIP and operating budgets together in July. Okay, so we're going to close now with questions to guide some discussion. These were also included in the memo, so you've likely seen these before. We can start from the top, or I could go through all of them and we can decide which ones we would like to answer. So for instance, the first one, of all the connections into the city strategic plan, including its strategies and priority actions, what areas do you want to see or learn more about? If we want, we can start with that one, or we can just kind of go through all of them.
I think that we could read them and then we
Okay.
could just have a less structured conversation about it.
That sounds good.
Does that sound?
Yeah.
You can leave them up.
Okay, perfect. Great.
Yeah, go ahead, Harmon.
Okay. Well, Sam, I'll go in your order. At least I'll just ask a question about the first bullet. So, I get that one of the reasons why there's a big priority on public safety in our priority actions, and that's in large part, from the way I read it, was based on the connection with the city's strategic plan. Do you think I have that right, just as a premise?
It may be that might need to ask a clarifying question, but I think for us, it's this intersection of safety as a top city priority, rangers doing a lot of our safety work, so we want to capture those connections. But with our strategy around presence on the land, as a strategic enhancement option at open space, we've really been focused on a 47,000 plus acre system with only X number of rangers. How do we make sure that those folks are a presence, proactively engaging? They're getting called on, every type of call you can imagine on the system. So I think for us, we were seeing a lot of interconnectedness there, where we're already focused on how to best mobilize the rangers, how to have the rangers partner with other law enforcement in the county and city, and then how we're leveraging our education and outreach folks as non-law enforcement folks to really be out on patrol helping to talk to visitors. So they are our safety connection, right? As many of them are post-certified law enforcement officials, but I think we had already viewed that as a focus area for us. But Dan, if you have any other comments on that.
No, just to add, and then wildfire comes under this safety one as well.
Yeah.
So
I'm definitely, aware of that and much less concerned about that connection with wildfire. I think that is really part of the core mission in my judgment of what OSMP is supposed to do. I wanted to really focus more on the public safety in terms of policing aspect. And if this is really a way of characterizing what OSMP staff does to match with the city's strategic plan goals for public safety, that's one thing. But if we're making sort of greater efforts to dovetail into the city's priorities for public safety by reallocating our resources towards rangers doing policing, then I would suggest that that's probably not that's not a direction that I support as an OSBT member. And we talked about this at the retreat when we were talking about policing Flagstaff and the impact of the public safety issues that are happening along Flagstaff on our ranger population. And it seems pretty depressing, running 2 rangers in a car overnight and then having them not be able to work in the daytime because they have to sleep it off. And I suggested at that time that maybe it's a budget issue and we ought to reallocate resources. And nobody likes to shrink their budget and give their money over to a different department, but in this case, that might be a good idea. So, I just wanted to make my point clear, which is that to the extent that, what we're reporting back on in dovetailing with the city's strategic plan on public safety is really just, a way of showing that we're doing our part, that's fine. But if we're taking the next step and trying to, over allocate resources to show the city that, we're helping more with public safety, I wouldn't really support that.
Yeah, I would see it more as a symbiotic relationship where the first step, the strategic plan, the city is new tool. So inventory, what are we currently doing that sort of stays here? But in terms of then, how do we enhance areas in these priority actions? I would say right now the expectation is that you're enhancing in areas that you feel are within your mission. We wouldn't have. I don't think anybody's being asked to go outside of the open space charter purposes in order to meet this. But for wildfire, for how I take it as a department director, okay, strategy number 2 clearly says this is a priority for the city. I feel like I can be more aggressive in making budget decisions or additional staff resources or whatever in that area, knowing that I might have the political support going above when budget decisions are made more at the highest level rather than at the department level. So I think that it does have a role in helping us determine where we think we could enhance and not only get the support within our department and within the board, but within the whole city if we feel like we're hitting a top area that the city wants us to hit. So it plays a role in enhancing, but I don't think there's an expectation that you go out of your way to make it happen, even if it's not really related to what you do. If that makes sense.
No, it does, and I appreciate your perspective on that. And I also want to say that my comments come from an overarching sense that the management strategies that the city is engaging in from a sort of top-down perspective and the way that the department, at least this, I don't look at other departments much anymore now that I'm just doing this OSBT work, but the way that you all as staff are working with the city to dovetail our priorities with the city's overarching priorities is really spectacular. It's just incredible to see the thoughtfulness and the management schema, both from the manager's office and the way you're responding to it, and then the proactive things that OSMP is doing as well. So thank you.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback on that comment? Because I agree with you. You said it much more eloquently than I ever could. But when I read, and particularly because it's listed as strategy number 1, it feels like this is a top priority for us as a department. And it says reimagining policing plan. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, that's not what OSMP, that's not what open space is about. But it's the first thing that you read because it's strategy number 1. And it doesn't, that's not where my heart is in our work here on open space, reimagining policing. It doesn't resonate with me. And I have certain feelings about policing in general. Obviously want our lands to be safe and accessible to all people, but I just don't feel like we are here to be reimagining policing.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that you brought it up. I frankly don't, I assume safety was put as number 1 for a reason. I frankly don't recall. It's been several years. But around reimagining policing, as we think about it from the budget lens, there are a bunch of action items within that plan where our rangers are involved. So for example, there's a focus on training officers differently and training them on different community approaches and making sure they're up to date on, you know, the latest in equity thinking and inclusion thinking. And we send our rangers to those trainings and we pay for those things. And so we're making sure that we track into those strategies to the extent that they apply, right? But I certainly don't want to conflate that we feel overall ownership for that strategy. That's a police strategy, but there are ways that our ranger group is interacting with BPD every day. And we want to make sure that if we're making budget investments in those strategies, that we're capturing that for awareness. But yeah, I think unsurprisingly, most of our work will fall into environmental sustainability, right? We know we have the climate and wildland fire, we have our ongoing work, and there's some around multimodal and different types of access to trails, where those are really the places that we play the most in the city strategic plan.
I'd like to jump in on this, and I'm just remembering back to the end of our retreat when we were talking about Flagstaff, and one of our rangers got emotional because that person felt seen, and I got the sense that that person was feeling like they were kind of suffering and put in a position that was difficult professionally and didn't feel seen. And so I don't know what reimagining policing means, but I don't know which of the bullets this is directly addressing, but I would love to see evidence in the budget, not just ours, but just citywide, that we're doing something so that we have a solution for that. And I don't know what that is. If it's, you know, it's one of these things where it feels like it's this intersectional area where whose purview is it? And well, we need to solve for Flagstaff. And I don't know if there's something that we could do as a board to elevate this. I don't know if this is one of those things. I mean, you know, we're supposed to provide guidance on the budget, but that doesn't necessarily have to happen just once in the fall. We could go to council and say, yo, this is something that cuts across the traditional lines, and we'd like to highlight it, and we'd like it to be a priority across the whole budget. I mean, I also know, Dan, that's what the executive budget team's job is to do too. I guess what I'm trying to say is, one, I would like to see evidence that we're going to address that issue, and so that particular ranger, and then all of them in general, aren't in that position anymore. And two, I'm curious to know what we can do as a board or as a staff to elevate this so we're not stuck in our departmental silos, and we can take a citywide view on that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, I know we're all taking notes and thinking through what pieces to bring forward in the budget. One of the SAM slides, which I think is great, is showing that we don't want the budget to just be about the budget, right? There's agenda items throughout your year that target specific topics that are important in the budget, but that may need deeper discussion. So something like Flagstaff management planning and how to fund that and how to move forward with that. There may be places we reference it in the budget, and or it may be scheduled as a separate topic on an agenda where we can dive a little bit deeper. You all have, through the retreat, through some of our previous packets, I think you're seeing the severity and type of crime on open spaces changing, and the rangers' jobs are changing, and we're trying to give them as much support as we can and make sure we're set up for the next 10 years, right? So I think the partnership with them has been great. They've been great in bringing forward all of their concerns. I'm so glad that they were there at the retreat to share that. And we'll think about ways. I mean, we're talking about the budget, and so inherent in that is the ranger budget, and we can talk about how to break that down more and what some of those key issues are, what capital funding might support some of these projects, but it could also be that there's deeper dives in other touch points throughout your board calendar if that's more supportive.
When I'm reading this memo, what I thought I was seeing was that table is from 2024, and that the 2026 examples are more in these written bullet points where wildfire and climate resilience and enhanced presence on the land and so forth. I think it's page 5 are listed. Am I reading that correctly? Is it true that the safe and policing piece is an example from 2024, and that where you're starting to list out actual more detailed potential priorities for 2026 is coming down on page 5?
Yeah, I think Sam's looking up the
Yeah,
specific
so
page numbers while we talk.
I think two different planning documents. The strategic plan, which Reimagine Placing, that's a citywide adopted strategy for all 20 departments and all 1,600 staff members. When we start getting into what the director's team has called out as, hey team, as a single department, these couple of areas, let's pay a closer attention to these over the next 2 years. Those are our OSMP strategic areas, which is not the same and not really even related in terms of what they are to the citywide strategic plan. So,
Okay, I see. And so Harmon, what you're saying is that our ranger operations tied to policing feels like a bit is not aligned with where you want to go, where you would personally feel comfortable endorsing that we go.
That's
Or can you?
no, I
I'm
think
just a
that's
little, yeah.
maybe that. Do you mind if I? Yeah. So all I was saying was I understand that policing is part of rangering, but and the reason why it's priority action number one is because that's what it is in the citywide strategic plan. So it's not necessarily OSMP's priority number one. I'm just saying that to the extent that we're trying to show the city that we're meeting their strategic goals, that we don't go overboard in turning our rangers into cops to help the city do policing, that it should probably go the other way around.
Thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead, Brady.
Somewhat related. I'm curious to know, and maybe we could dive into this at another time, but is there tension between the city plan and the OSMP master plan? Are there times where you're parsing all these plans and you're going, there's some dissonance here? And then Lauren, you said one thing and I can't help myself. You said, how do we keep all these old plans alive? And I just want to remind us that we want to put some of them out to pasture. So I couldn't let that one go.
No,
Okay.
Casey left, but she'll be thrilled to hear that when she watches this back later. Yeah.
So you're
thank
not
you.
saying kill them. You're just saying put them out to
No,
pasture.
they
That's
just
how we
need to.
keep them alive.
They just need to go and live out their days somewhere else.
Right. Or in an ideal scenario, we've accomplished all the actions and we get to say, check the box. No, do I think they're diametrically opposed? No. Are there places where the city has priorities that we aren't involved in? Sure. I think part of this is based on our funding structure, right? So you have the general fund and then you have enterprise funds, and those enterprise funds were voted on by the community because the community cared about those things being funded separately. And so there are inherent, I don't know, strengths and limitations to that, right? Where do we partner with utilities? Of course, but there are things that are inherent in their structure and their charter and their funding mechanism that we don't play in the city strategic plan. So I think when I was mentioning the balance, like the city strategic plan, I think is a great guiding document. I live in Boulder. If I'm a community member, I can see like, this is what my whole city cares about doing. Does it cover everything we do? No, of course not. And then we've got our priorities in our master plan that tell us a little bit more, but I've not experienced a place where I think they're diametrically opposed or problematic or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, where we're at, so there's a citywide leadership team, which is city manager's office and all the department directors. So that's my team one, where the deputies, the director's team, that's their team one. So I've got a little bit more of a daily interaction to the city strategic plan. It's like where we're at right now of how it's working is, hey, department heads, where do you see, which ones of these do you feel like you can champion and be the lead? And so I actually stepped up and said, I think we can take 7C, for example. So 7C, which is the one looking at that multi-mode access points to key open space trail areas, we're going to be looked upon within the citywide strategic plan to be a leader in bringing that forward. So I didn't sign up for reimagining policing, for instance, right? So that's where maybe there would be some concern of like, why is open space doing that? But there are enough good tie-ins where I would feel confident saying, yeah, we can be the lead on that one. And so I don't see anything that's diametrically opposed at this point. I see more of like, where are those opportunities to see your part into it? Yeah.
One more question, then I'm done. I've always understood how we do enhancements because that's one thing we vote on, and I've had less insight into how we look at areas that we want to deprioritize so we free up resources for other places. And in the memo, it seemed like the main strategy that was mentioned was not filling vacancies, which is effective, but a relatively passive management strategy. And so I'm just wondering if there if there are other active management strategies that we're taking on the operational side, and if you feel, from my own experience, it may or may not bear out here. Capital budgets are easier to cut, they're easier to modulate, but sometimes what's easier isn't always what's in the best interest of the community and our priorities. And so how do you think about that? How do you balance that? And could you give us a little insight?
Yeah, it's a big question. I'm glad you asked it. I love talking about reallocations. And the structure of the open space department has changed so much in the time that we've been here, and changing sales tax increments. And we got really good as some of these increments went away or went to a different department or revenues changed, at finding ways to scale back quickly and try to be as agile as we can. We have a $42 million budget this year, and 2/3 of that is personnel. So my most basic answer to that is yes, I think there's a limit to how much you can quickly cut CIP before you have to look at everything else. And I want you to know that we do look at all of those things. So everybody on the work plan steering team has heard me say a bajillion times, it's about balanced reductions across every expenditure type, right? And we think about that in terms of personnel. The one we hardly ever touch is seasonal and temporary staffing, non-personnel expense, debt, and capital, right? So in the pre-master plan days, we had CIPs $10 to $12 million a year. A lot of that aligned with flood recovery and trying to get some key maintenance projects done before our sales tax increments changed. And Sam, I think in the memo has a chart of even just from 24 to 25 to 26, you see us ramping down that CIP about $500,000 a year to a place where we're getting to 5 million. If I were to look at average actual expenditures in our CIP, now actuals compared with what we project in any given year, and if I take out the flood, we tend to spend 4 to 6 in actual spending based on staff capacity, right? So every project manager can handle X number of contracts on their work plan. And so the ballpark it tends to be in that 4 to 6. And so we've budgeted 5, like that's a guess, right? And that in out years may shift slightly up or down. But we want to make sure that with our staffing level comes the right amount of non-PE dollars for those folks to spend, right? That they have access to the resources they need to accomplish those projects. So it's a tough balance. We're looking at it all the time, and our staffing levels have grown over 10 years. And so on the fund financial, the way this works, this is an overly technical answer, capital savings are one time in the year that they occur, right? The way the city has us model PE, it's on a 6-year horizon. So if we remove one position, that shows up as a savings every year in those 6 years. So times 6 on the impact of making some of those operating decisions. To be clear, there's no reduction in force scenario right now. We're not exploring any of that. And I can give a couple of examples. So Janelle stepped into our deputy director role, and we were able to look at our volunteerism work group, our education outreach work group. We made the decision to merge those under one senior manager, and then chose not to backfill the other senior manager, which was already vacant, and then we expired it, right? So when we think about PE reductions, those are the types of things that we're thinking about right now. Where we're looking, another example would be, we used to have a community engagement person here at Open Space. The city's been bolstering its comms and engagement department and providing resources to departments and helping think through engagement that we didn't have before. So when we look at the work plan for that position, we can now get those resources through the general fund, through our cost allocation in another department. Now I'm oversimplifying it. There's always complexity in that, but we were able to make a decision not to fill that position, which saves that salary over the 6-year horizon. So we talk about fiscally constrained, and I think that's real. And we're trying to keep things balanced. We're not in a reduction in force situation. And I mentioned seasonals and temps. We have not talked about reducing that in years. And in fact, we've been bolstering living wage and benefits for those folks. And really, they're out doing the maintenance that the community cares about on the ground, right? So we want to make sure that as we're thinking about this, we're coming in a really balanced way. I say all of this understanding that we don't have revenue projections from finance yet for next year. I don't know what the level of change is going to need to be. I think right now we're anticipating slow growth, is my understanding. But when Sam says we get all this information in May and then need to react, that's what we mean, right? We need to know exactly how much revenue is coming in to make some of those calls, and we try to be as agile as we can in making those. But yeah, reducing CIP further is on the table. I can tell you, we just had our first CIP review meeting last week, and we have $15 million in requests from project managers for a $5 million budget. So we're really in that place of having to be really strategic about what we say yes to on the CIP.
Thanks, Lauren. Did you have anything more, Brady? How about you, John? No? Sarah, go ahead.
So in the just highlighting some of the things that I feel excited about and where I see opportunities to have a lot, like thinking strategically, and where there are opportunities to have benefit, thinking through staffing, understanding we have budget constraints. I think that when I look at the parameter mowing program and we tie that into community engagement to have people thinking about fuels in their yards, when we look at fuel mitigation and we think about community activism and engaging volunteers and what can be done, especially when we're talking about trying to engage people in that bracket that are like the younger generation. They're strong, they're wanting, they see what's happening in the world, they're vulnerable, they're feeling that vulnerability, they want to be empowered. So organizing volunteer programs and engaging the community, just engaging the community to help with this, to something to the order of what we were talking about before. It's not, the onus is not all just on the cities and the city employees. We have an incredible community here of people who love to be active. Also on the tribal engagement, and I am so excited about this Fort Chambers Poor Farm site management plan and what's possible there and finding the right partners. And I do promise to send some really good applicants over to help think about how we can utilize that land to be proving out models of cash crops that are resilient and also maybe regenerative in nature, engaging the community. There are some, I think, public-private relationships that are in the process of being built that might be interested in knowing about this, so I'll be sure to alert them. And then also just on the grazing and the farming in general, and also agriculture and water stewardship as it relates to science and climate resilient operations. I think the world and us, I know myself personally, we need hope, we need excitement, we need to feel engaged. And this is the conversation of the future. This is what people are in the next generation really out there talking about and wanting to get engaged in. So let's get ahead of the ball on that. Let's be putting dollars behind that. Let's show that we are an exemplary community, that we continue to be an exemplary community in the world for what's possible with our agricultural lands, with our grazing lands, and then also, of course, I love the multimodal access. I love getting people out more onto the trails and having education about wildlife and wildlife preservation for our youth and getting the community involved in that as well. So as we're looking at capital improvements, I would love to see spaces for the community to be gathering and bringing more people onto those spaces as well. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think I'll just provide some closing thoughts here. I agree with Brady. It's rare, I know, but that balance, because I look at the CIP and that's one-time money, and I see that going down to $5 million. I get your point, Lauren, that you've been spending in that neighborhood anyway, but I know we'd like to talk about this $40 million maintenance backlog. And I understand why we keep our temporary seasonal workers, because they are working on that. And just the community wants to make a dent in that. And I think we really need to look at our operating budget as well, because that is recurring money. And so having a little bit more visibility into that would be helpful for all of us, of like, okay, that we are in fact doing that. I, I like the fact that you've converted a lot of positions into wildfire mitigation positions like that. That was important for us to see that those positions were getting converted, that you're reducing positions by not backfilling. You're thinking creatively by selling residences that don't meet our charter purposes. It does seem like you're exploring all things for all possibilities for a budget constrained future. And so I appreciate that part of it. I feel nervous about the CIP going down so much because I want to see our maintenance backlog continue to be tended to. The other thing I'm looking forward to is in March, you're going to have that 6-year project list for us. I don't know if it was April or it was March, that we could have some visibility into what projects are we taking on in the next 6 years. I know that this is something that I've asked for in my time at Parks and Rec. We felt just like we didn't have any level of control. Like we talk about the budget priorities in words rather than in terms of projects. Not that we want to micromanage all of your projects, but the projects are what we see and that we feel that we as board members have contribution to like actually make happen. And so being able to have visibility and some say in what that, what makes it onto that 6-year priority list, and what doesn't, and I think is helpful for us and makes us feel like we're contributing to the community in a tangible way. And so those are my only comments. It sounds like Carmen wants to weigh in. Go ahead.
I feel bad because you said you were going to provide some closing comments.
Okay.
I just wanted to address the other 3 bullets quickly. And so the second bullet are the strategic budget guidance areas that we'd want to see. Personally, I'm just a little interested in sort of fleet renewal, electrification, and what are the horizons for paying off in terms of dollars and carbon footprint, those reinvestments. And what do we do with the old, trucks or do we sell them? Just sort of how do you budget for fleet renewal? If that's not interesting to you guys, or it's too weird a topic, or the other board members don't want to hear about it, that's fine. It's just my opinion.
We love it.
Okay. Okay. I mean, it interests me. And then the other 2 bullets, I'm fine with. For the third bullet, strategic priority areas, the suggestions that you got from Sarah and Michelle. So I don't want to add anything to that. And then the last one regarding the proposed 2026 planning timeline is the slide that you put all the circular little icons on, different touches. That's great. So that concludes my bullet-based comments.
Lauren, you speak so knowledgeably about so many of these things, and you mentioned about how certain things have increased over the last 10 years. I think a 10-year look back at a few of these things. What's how many FTEs have we had over the last 10 years? And what was that PE trend line? What was the CIP trend line? What are those as a function of each other? And what's happened with the maintenance backlog? How has that trended over the last 10 years? Would provide us with some context beyond just waiting to see how much money we have in May, to tell us, the extent to which, if these trend lines continue, it brings us to a place that we want to be or not. And I don't know what month it would be good to see that. I'm happy to provide more detail about what those things, what those trend lines might look like via email. But I'm just feeling the need for some context.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny, internally, the team will say, when can we stop talking about the flood? The answer is never, because that's in that same 10-year horizon, right? And so you can sort of track the spikes and dips, like the COVID years and revenue is tight, and the flood years and we're spending, and there's a story there, right? And so what we've tried to do in years past is a 10-year CIP, a 10-year CIP if you exclude acquisition. The personnel side's interesting. The city tool only gives you last year, current, and next. But we have those. I mean, I've been here 10 years, so we have them for 10 years. So those are easy enough to compile. Other things like trails maintenance, backlog, and such, I'll partner and we'll figure it out. And it could be like some of that comes through the budget and some through our regular reporting on trails. We'll figure out, but I want to make sure you have what you need, obviously, as we go through the budget process. But that seems doable enough to me.
Okay, this is my closing remark. I just want to thank you for letting us have a touch point earlier on in the year. And this is something that came from, I think, 2 retreats ago, and based on Brady's feedback. And so being able to talk about the budget at a higher level in January is amazing. Thanks for doing that the 2nd year in a row. Okay.
Thanks to the team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know it's important to you. So it's 7:59. So I'll come up with 30 seconds of director updates.
You can have 4 minutes and 30 seconds if you like.
I just want to let you know that the work out at Marshall Mesa, that the DRMS has finished with their major excavation. They're now into the backfilling and grading operation. They're expecting to be on site for a few more weeks. And then things are going to be turned over to us. And we have a few touch points planned for 2025 in which Jeff and his team will report of how we're transitioning out of mine mitigation and into habitat restoration and trailhead reconstruction. So just want to let you know that if you were hoping to see the site and you haven't seen it yet, if you don't get out there in the next week or so, it's being filled. So just want to let you live with that. And now it is 8 o'clock and I'm done with my director updates.
Thank you. Meeting is adjourned. 8 o'clock.